This is Fujifilm's new X-T3 camera, just been released. I picked this one up in Tokyo in Japan because I spent a week there. I'm just off the plane, in fact, so I'm a little bit groggy. But over the last few days I've been shooting with it, and I have to say it's highly impressive. There's one or two small setbacks to it, or competitive setbacks compared to some other models on the market, but other than that it's actually a really good camera. I'm going to go through some of the things that I have found interesting about it. Now, the first and most important thing is the image quality, and it is absolutely stellar. So I've been using Fuji cameras for a while. I have the X Pro 2, I have the X-T3, I even have the X100F, and they all use the X-Trans sensor, which is a 24 megapixel sensor. It's actually really good. I've been very, very happy with the quality of those pictures, but this has a BSI, a backside illuminated sensor. It's a 26 megapixel new sensor, and it is definitely better in low light. It is definitely slightly sharper than the X Pro 2 or the X-T3 or the X-T2. I'm going to stick up some photos so you can see a very, very rough approximation of what I'm talking about, including some photos that I've cropped pretty heavily so you can see the detail even when you crop down in the photos. Obviously, one of the advantages to the Fuji cameras is most of their lenses they have are actually excellent. So Fuji doesn't really make bad lenses. Now, I'm lucky enough to own a couple of really good lenses. This is the 35 millimeter lens, which is actually the 50 millimeter lens equivalent, and this is the 50 to 140, which is the equivalent to 70 to 200. This is a great portrait lens. This is actually a really good portrait lens as well. And it obviously helps when you're using lenses like that. Nevertheless, the image quality is really the calling card for this camera compared to other APS-C cameras I've found. One other thing to note about that backside illuminated sensor is it is much better in low light. Okay, much better means significantly better, noticeably better. I noticed it. I was taking shots with this in very dark environments in Tokyo, in a bar, in a cafe, and okay, yes, I was using a very good lens, a 56 millimeter f1.2, but I've used that with the X Pro 2 as well, and I really do think that the quality of the low light shots in this is noticeably better than the last generation of Fuji X cameras. Now, one of the main headline features of the X-T3 over the X-T2 is its speed, is the processor under the hood. It has a much, much faster engine, 2 to 3 times as fast, and that basically means that it can shoot in continuous high speed much, much quicker. So if you are shooting a bride walking down the aisle, or if you are shooting sports, for example, you can shoot up to 20 frames per second in electronic shutter mode here. That really is kind of incredible. Now, it has a continuous autofocus mode as well, which is supposed to keep up with that. In my experience, I've found that it does in good light. It still hunts a little bit in low light, but that's not that unusual. So it doesn't quite compare with Sony's A7 when it comes to autofocusing and tracking, particularly eye tracking. But it is a big step up from the X-T2 and the X Pro 2. And then there's just the ergonomics and the aesthetics. So this isn't a perfect camera to hold, and particularly in terms of the grip. Sometimes you will actually hit one or two buttons on the back side, but it's good enough. And aesthetically, Fuji is making the nicest looking cameras out there, in my opinion. They have this kind of vintage look, and sure, a lot of cameras have this. Olympus certainly have it. Even Nikon tried it with the DF, but I don't think anybody does it like Fuji. This is a camera that you kind of want to pick up and play with, and that's actually really important when you're talking about a camera, because our phones are now giving us really, really good shots. I have both the Huawei P20 Pro and the new iPhone XS Max, and they are really impressive. I took some really kind of, for me, impressive shots with that from a phone in Tokyo. So you've got to want to use your camera if you're not using it professionally, if you're just using it for, for a hobby or for leisure reasons, and you do want to pick up this Fuji, no less than you would the X Pro 2 or the X100F. Fuji just makes very, very aesthetically pleasing cameras. Now, obviously, this has all the other advantages of a mirrorless camera, like silent shooting, for example, which is the #1 most underrated advantage of a mirrorless camera. You're in a church, you're taking photographs of the bride and groom, but you're with a DSLR, you have this clack, 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 ta, 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 all the time, and you feel sometimes that you're disturbing the moment. You do not feel that with a mirrorless camera, whether it's Fuji, whether it's a Sony, Panasonic, or even the new cameras from Nikon and Canon themselves, the new mirrorless cameras. It is a massive advantage to be able to shoot silently, and obviously this camera has it. The other advantage is size. For what you're getting from this camera in terms of the image quality, you would normally only get that from a much bigger DSLR camera. So that's a huge advantage to shooting with a mirrorless camera. Now, many others are pointing to the 4K shooting on it and its 10-bit capability and 4K at 60 frames and 1080p at 120 frames as one of its selling points. It's not actually for me. I'm filming this video on HD at 1080p at 60 frames per second, and for me, that's actually good enough for 95% of cases. But if 4K is important, this camera has it. Okay, now I'm going to talk about some of maybe perceived negatives. So there are 2 or 3 that I would pick out. The first is it doesn't have in-body stabilization. Now, if you're not doing video, this isn't really a big deal. Fuji makes another camera called the X-H1 that does have in-body stabilization. In-body stabilization basically means that when you are shooting video in particular, it means that you get this nice smooth footage for photographers. It means that you can stop the shutter speed down to maybe 1/60th of a second or below, and you will still get sharp images. This doesn't have it. 1 or 2 of the rivals of this camera from other companies do have in-body stabilization. However, so if that's a big deal to you, then this won't be your camera. The other thing that actually probably more important to me that some other cameras have and this one doesn't is the screen. Now the screen here, it comes out like this, so that's very handy. It's a touch screen as well. But there are a couple of other models, particularly the Canon 60 Mark II on which I'm filming this review, and that has a flip out screen. Panasonics have them as well, the GH5 and some of the other Panasonic Lumix cameras, and it's invaluable for video. If you want to shoot a video and if you want to do a vlog, or if you want to take a photo of yourself or video of yourself, a flip out screen is absolutely crucial. This camera doesn't have it, and Fuji knows how to do it because its X-T100 camera, which it released a couple of months ago, does have a flip out screen. That's a budget model relative to this. So it can do it when it wants, and I'm a little bit disappointed. So as soon as Fuji makes a camera like this with the flip out screen, it will probably destroy the rest of the field entirely. But for now, Fuji is leaving the market a little bit open to rivals like the Canon 60 Mark II in particular, and some of the Panasonic Lumix models, because it doesn't have that flip out screen. And then the only other, negative or minor negative that's really worth mentioning is the battery life. It's okay, but it's just not that good. I've become accustomed now to bringing, a spare battery, sometimes 2 spare batteries, if I am, using a Fuji camera. On the upside, it uses the same battery as all the previous X line of cameras, including the X100F, and they're not that expensive to buy. But some of the other cameras, particularly the DSLRs like from Canon, Nikon, destroys the Fuji when it comes to battery life. You will get 1,000 shots, 800-900, 1,000 shots out of a Canon. You get 350 or 400 out of this, so you wouldn't want to be taking that many photos with it. So in summary, I would say that this is an absolutely superb effort from Fuji. It's actually cheaper than the previous model, the X-T2 was when it launched. It's €1,500. I remember when the X-T2 launched 2 years ago, it was I think €1,700. I mean, the X Pro 2, which I own and I love, it's not as good a camera as this, and I think it still costs more than this camera. So the way Fuji did that was by making it in China rather than Japan. A lot of people were worried. Did that mean that the quality would suffer? I really don't think it has. I haven't found it that to be the case thus far. Then again, I've only been shooting with it for a couple of days. I can't find any significant downsides with this at all. I have to say this is a huge hit for Fuji, and you can't really say that Fuji is a professional camera system. I know some people will, and the fanboys will come out and say that it is. Of course, you could shoot a wedding on it and that sort of stuff, but I know press photographers, I talk to them all the time in the Independent and elsewhere, and they're not, Fuji isn't there yet with a fully professional setup, but the image quality you're getting from this camera is absolutely superb for the money you're spending. And I can see why people who buy into this system really swear by it and become advocates for it. I'm into different systems. I own Canon cameras, I own Panasonic cameras, I own Fuji cameras, I even own a Leica. But at the moment, this Fuji system and this Fuji X-T3 is, if you're in the market for a semi-pro, relatively high-end camera that's really pleasing to use, that has a great selection of lenses, it's very hard to beat this, to beat the X-T3 camera. Yes, it only has an APS-C sensor, and that's a slightly smaller sensor than a quote-unquote full-frame sensor that you'll get in Canon 6D Mark II, for example, and that does have significance for things like low-light shooting and depth of field. But that gap has been narrowed massively. Now, I know what I'm talking about here because I own Canon full-frame cameras. I own some really nice Canon L lenses as well. I know exactly what the advantage is to shooting with those cameras in low light. I do some work sometimes with theater, for example, and shooting in all kinds of different light. So I've seen the differences, and I can tell you that beforehand, using a 6D Mark II or 6D or a 5D Mark III, for example, with a Canon 70-200 lens, I would always go with that rather than a Fuji X body with the 70-200 equivalent for shooting low light work, because I used both systems and I compared, and the Canon was always better in low light. I can tell you that Fuji is narrowing the gap with this new sensor. So that's huge. That's very, very significant. Anyway, here are some of the photos I've taken with the X-T3 over the last few days. Now, these are straight out of camera. I haven't edited these at all in terms of brightening or adding color or anything like that. I have reduced some of them, like I've cropped in on some of them to show you the quality in these shots.